All right.
Hello, it's Larry Clark, and I'm here with another Meet the Composer video, and we got Sean O'Loughlin on the line with Dan Black and his band students. And Dan, tell us where you all are from.
Orchestra.
Oh, it's orchestra. I was wrong. Okay, it's even better. We like string instruments. They sound good. Great. So take it away, Dan, and ask the questions you are dying to ask. Sean
Sure. Yeah, we're all from Council Bluffs Community School District, the Lynx Orchestra Program, 612. I was wondering, Sean, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself to us and telling us, what you've been up to and what you're about, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a thrill and a pleasure to have you use the music that I've written with your ensemble, and excited to talk about a little bit about that. But I'm based in the Los Angeles area. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and actually Larry Clark was my marching band director at Syracuse University. So we've known each other for probably too many years, but and more years to come, of course. But so I've been in LA now for about 20 years, so I'm really fortunate to make a living as a composer for Excelsior Music and a couple other publishers, along with writing for orchestras. And I'm actually the principal pops conductor for Symphoria, which is the orchestra in Syracuse, New York. And then I'm also the principal pops conductor for the Victoria Symphony up in British Columbia, Canada. And then I guest conduct kind of around the country with different orchestras. And along the lines, I've actually been working as a arranger and an orchestrator with some different artists and singers and songwriters along the way, like Josh Groban, Kelly Clarkson, Pentatonics. I did some work with them a couple years back, and so it's kind of a mixed bag of different projects that I get to work on. And one of the things that I really enjoy about writing for Excelsior is the fact that I get to write original music and get to kind of keep my brain working in that mode versus the arranging one, which I enjoy as well. But writing original music that you and your students can play and perform is really one of the real treasures of what I get to do. So that in a nutshell.
Wonderful. That last part about, writing new and original music, that's probably the number one question students had about where do these ideas even come from?
Oh, that's a $100,000 question, but because every composer works differently, and grabbing an idea or grabbing something to base a piece of music on is really a bit of a challenge, because everyone asks, well, how do you start, right? And I always tell people, you start with one note and then write a second note and see where it goes from there. Because one of the most intimidating things for a composer is just either a blank screen or a blank page, like what to do and what to kind of create, something like that. For me, my process is I usually come up with some kind of like little nugget or little idea that I want to expand into a real piece. And the biggest challenge is to, coming up with that idea and then feeling strongly enough about the idea to warrant building a whole piece around it. Because we'll have, different noodles of ideas here and there. And kind of sources for me to get some ideas or walks, bike rides, car ride, anything that I'm actually away from an instrument and I'm just using my head, my brain to do it, because that's my most important instrument is my brain, and being able to write kind of more absolute style versus, the constraints of my piano playing. My God, if I wrote like I played piano, I don't think anyone would want to play it. But so anyway, so, you do your studying. You do your studying what a violin does, what it doesn't do, a viola, cello, and all that kind of stuff. And so once you kind of get like a little bit of an idea, then you start almost, you get a melody. I'm a very melody-driven person. So if I get a melody that I really like, then I'll start playing with it, where you take ideas, where you elongate it and like double the rhythm of it, or truncate it or shorten it and make it go faster. Then you start working with counterpoint in terms of, hey, what line, balances this out or makes this a interesting kind of next thing. And then harmony kind of comes. So you kind of build it in layers as you go, because when you look at a piece of music, it can be intimidating, right? You got a full score with everything. And even your own part can be intimidating, like, oh my God, how did he know how to do this? Or how did she know how to do this, when, where, and how? So the process tends to me to go both linearly and vertically at the same time as you move through. And you start doing it enough and you get into your own little groove of your bag of tricks, and and what things work for you and what things don't. But I always say to, students that are interested in getting into writing and writing pieces of music is just start writing ideas. The only way to get better is to do it, and to do it and to do it to do it. And the technology now is great between Finale, Sibelius, and some of these other basic notation programs where you can hear the playback and hear what it sounds like almost immediately. But I encourage, and maybe Dan, you're able to do this with your students, is to have the kids play it. There's nothing like having a piece of music that you wrote come to life in the real world. And you can see, oh man, that one interval is really a lot tougher, because sometimes the computer playback, you don't know the difficulty, right? Because it always plays it perfectly. So to see some of your friends kind of like, oh my God, I remember writing some things in college. I wrote a brass quintet, and I was a trumpet player. So I was in a brass quintet in college. And I wrote, writing yourself your own part is always, it can be a very challenging thing. So one of the guys said to me, hey, how come you have all the rests and we're playing all the time? I'm like, hey, membership has its privileges, right? So, but that feedback was good, because I was able to see them say, hey, I need some rest here. So when you're, kind of creating a piece of music, you have to realize that not everyone has to play at the same time. You can have people, different colors created by people resting and others playing at the same time. So I hope that helps at least get the process rolling.
Yeah. It's neat to hear you talk about asking your friends to play it. That's something that I always include in our composition activities, is asking a neighbor to play it and everything. Yeah. But we recently, before school got closed, we were composing melodies that communicated an emotion in our sixth grade orchestra. And it was really neat how, without much direction, students, given the inspiration, they're able to communicate those things, and they didn't have to be an expert in music theory in order to do that. But when you're putting your music together, obviously there's a whole expertise that informs your decisions, and a context for those decisions, maybe who you're writing it for. How does that process work for you? How do you make your creative choices?
I think certain instruments for us elicit certain emotions along the way, and based on the tempo and the the harmony as well. I mean, obviously we can phrase, when we think of sad or somber piece of music, we think of minor keys. It's just a natural kind of assimilation that we do. But for me, I always think in terms of orchestration, whether it be for orchestra or concert band or full orchestra or whatever it may be. I always think about what instruments can elicit certain emotions and all that, and based on what type of piece of music that I want to write. I noticed in your questions, Moonlit Skies came across, and have you guys had a chance to perform that or work on it?
Not yet. It would be a thing on our list right now, but
yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting piece for me, because I was actually guest conducting not too far from you guys in Detroit with the Detroit Symphony last year or 2 years ago. And they put me up in this beautiful 1 or 2 bedroom flat that one of the donors of the orchestra had donated to the orchestra to be able to use. And so I wasn't in a hotel, and they had this beautiful grand piano that I could use. And I had some downtime between rehearsals and performances, and I wrote this piece during that time in Detroit. So the way that the apartment set was, the moon would kind of come in through these big glass windows. And so it was really, the emotion of that piece came from the inspiration of the space that I was in. And so this idea of the opening little motif in that particular piece came from just sitting in that piano and letting the atmosphere, letting kind of everything kind of come in. And string orchestra really felt right for that kind of piece, because of the kind of haunting nature and haunting quality of seeing the moon at night, in this moonlit skies kind of coming down. It immediately, I thought of strings. And then when Larry Clark heard it for strings, he goes, hey, you got to do that for band too, because that's a pretty good piece of music. So, which, I mean, you've experienced through the years, right? That you see a lot of band pieces turn into string pieces. But and even in that process of now taking a piece that was written specifically for string orchestra and then expanding that into the more instruments in a concert band setting, created another thing. Like what of those like really haunting lines, what instruments do you give it to? Do you give it to a flute, or maybe an oboe that has oboe has a richer, more kind of somber tone at times and sweeter sound than what a flute can do, or a trumpet or a brass. You know, how do you use those colors to really make the phrases, make the music kind of take it into a different direction? So so that's where I go, and a lot of times I use what I've listened to as well. I'm a big movie score fan, film score fan. So, you know, you hear what John Williams does with a really dramatic, emotional moment in a film, and you kind of take that little bag of tricks and, you know, apply it to your own music to make those instrument choices to really get the maximum out of the music that you're writing.
I have two questions to follow up to that. One is silly, and the other is actually serious.
There's no silly questions.
Sometimes when I've been either a performer or if I'm just listening to something, I remember playing Summon the Heroes by John Williams.
Oh, yeah.
Concert band setting once, and thinking after rehearsal, it seems so obvious. Why couldn't I come up with something like that? It's just,
yeah.
Do you ever have that reaction when you hear things?
Especially when a melody, and I always go to Henry Mancini for the most simple melodies. He would write all these diatonic, you know, Moon River, diatonic. I think it uses 8 notes. I mean, it's complete diatonic, and it doesn't, you know, it's not the Rite of Spring. It's not, you know, Ligeti or any of these crazy, you know, progressive type pieces. It's so, like you said, blatantly obvious of like, oh my God, that's how it always should have been, you know. And we hear the main Star Wars theme of like, of course that's how Star Wars was supposed to go, you know. Is it frustrating from a composer standpoint? Absolutely, because, you know, you go through the process, and, you know, if we had all the, you know, the notes that we had thrown in the trash, you know, to make just one piece of music, it'd be this, you know, grand heap of things. And I'm sure Larry can attest as well. The stuff that we throw out is, you know, way more in amount than the stuff that we end up using. But I remember reading something about John Williams where his process that he would go through, because to your point, Dan, his melodies are very transparent and very, you know, especially the ones we all know and love. And he would spend countless hours tweaking one little note here, one little rhythm there, pushing something over to the side to get it to where it sounds like that, of like, the aha moment of like, of course this is what it was going to sound like. So one of the worst things for me is like going back maybe several years after I've written a piece of music, and, you know, either I'll do a Skype session like this with a band or whatever it may be, and it's a piece I hadn't really, you know, listened to that I had written in a long time, and I go like this of like, oh, I would never do that now. You know, as we evolve as writers and as musicians, you know, there's certain things that you felt good. And kids, I'm sure that's the same thing with you. Like if you hear yourself playing the band last year, you're like, oh my, in the orchestra, like, oh my God, what were we doing? And then this year it's like, oh, it's even better, you know? So that happens too in the writing world, as well as you work through pieces.
You know, you're talking a lot about the refining process for composing something. It's not that you just write it down once and then, you know, that magical inspiration is just there. Is there a way to put that into words? Is there a criteria you have for a final product about, you know, before you send it to Larry or something like that to be published? Is it a personally driven criteria? Is it a professional thing?
If I have the luxury of time to set it down for a few days and then revisit it, usually your ear will tell you, oh yeah, that's where it should go. Or I'll sit so time away is a very valuable tool. And I always get nervous when I send something to Larry and he doesn't write back right away. And I'm like, uh-oh, he's got his red pen out. He's really, you know, doing some surgery on this thing to kind of make it right. But, you know, and having someone else listen to it as well, Dan, is really helpful, because you can get feedback that way. And not necessarily to be published, but just to be the best piece of music that it can be.
Right.
So sometimes I say to myself, and Larry will laugh, but I try to say to myself, what would Larry say? And like put my Larry Clark hat on or my editor hat on and try and distance myself from being the writer as much as possible, because I think that helps to look at it objectively. Otherwise, you're too close to it, too personal to it. I was telling Larry before we got on, but I just finished a setting of the beautiful Celtic carol, Wexford carol, Irish carol. And I've been wanting to do it for several years, and hey, oh look, we have the time now. So I have a little more time to kind of get into writing and all that. And I was finishing up this morning, and just as I was making parts and trying to, because I'll probably do it in the holiday shows this coming year that we're going to, once the orchestras are back up and running, it'll be nice to kind of have that feeling again of playing for people. And I know you guys are itching to play for people as well instead of a video screen. But I changed the whole choir part. It was with choir and orchestra, and I changed the whole choir part just this morning because I felt like it didn't do enough. Like there was a couple big climactic moments, and I was looking at it, and I hadn't done enough with the choir part to make it like a really big, powerful moment. So from that standpoint, again, taking a little time, like writing something, taking some time, and then going back to it, it can be really illuminating. And I'm sure it's the same way when you write like a paper for one of your classes, one of your math or social studies classes, where you're like, it sounds so good at like 11 o'clock at night when you finish it for the first time. And then you wake up the next morning and you're like, what was I thinking? It sounded so good last night. So the same thing is true with music as well along those lines.
And the panic starts to set in.
Yeah.
You know, it's really neat to think about. So how do you know when something's ready to share then? If, you know, you're always revisiting it and coming back to it to try and make those choices, when does that point come? And how does it feel to share?
Well, at some point you do have to let it go. I mean, you can't be writing a single piece of music your whole life. I mean, you can always go back and tweak. At some point, you know, you just have to let it go. And there's an inner satisfaction that I have. Like, I feel like it's as good as I can write in this moment, in this time for this, you know, this type of piece. So I remember the first time that I, you know, had something played, you know, going back into college when I first started writing and, you know, starting to study composition. It was very intimidating, right? Because you have this feeling of like, what is going to happen, right? And so the process, when I get something new out in the world, even to still has that same, like, little bit of nervousness, a little bit of anxiety, but deeply satisfying because you know that this music is coming to life that didn't exist just moments ago. So I still look at it as a kid in college hearing my first thing that I wrote, you know, performed. And I don't think that ever gets old, you know, along those lines.
Here's some of the student questions that they brought up. What's your favorite piece that you've composed? I'm sure you have many favorites, like picking a favorite child. No?
Yeah, no, you can't pick a favorite child. They're all good. There's one moment in a piece that I wrote that has a bit of a real personal take for me. So I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and I grew up, you know, I went to the university there, and I had my private teacher was in the Syracuse Symphony for many, many years. And about 8 years ago, the orchestra unfortunately folded and went bankrupt. And so this orchestra that I grew up listening to heard all these wonderful Mahler symphonies, Mozart symphonies, you know, you name it. Copland 3, I remember the big performance of Copland's Third Symphony, Beethoven 9. I mean, all of these really remarkable musical kind of foundations for me were all of a sudden silenced. And my trumpet teacher was still in the orchestra at the time, and the orchestra members kind of kept the music going and played for free for a year or two before they could kind of reorganize into this group that's now called Symphoria. And I was really touched because they asked me to come on and conduct the first performance. We did a holiday pop show because those are always usually a pretty popular program that we can sell tickets to and kind of get the thing going again. And one of the caveats with that is he asked me to write an original work that would kind of signal the orchestra coming back, you know, to playing again in Syracuse. So I wrote a piece called Symphoria. It's about 3.5 minutes long. It's not published. It was written especially for this orchestra to kind of signal the return of symphony music in central New York. And it's funny, when he asked me to do it, I said, I don't know, I'm, you know, busy doing 3 other things. Well, the next day I had it done. Like, I just sat down and I was so focused and hyper-focused on the emotion of that, of bringing the orchestra back to that city and to my hometown, that that piece of music is really, really, really special to me. And then I got to perform it with the Chicago Symphony a few years later. I programmed it on they had me there guest conducting a program, and I forget who it was with. It might have been Melissa Etheridge or someone like that. And they needed a piece to open up the program to feature the orchestra. And so I very shamelessly self-promoted my piece to play, and the orchestra loved it. It was a thrill hearing, you know, the Chicago Symphony play original work of yours. So never miss an opportunity to do that if you have the opportunity. So there you have it. And maybe it'll be published someday. I don't know. It's so, like I said, it's such a personal piece for me that it kind of stays in our library with the orchestra in Syracuse for now.
Well, speaking of surrounding yourself with really cool people and doing cool things, one of the first things that came up with the students is, do you have any favorite memories working with famous musicians or artists? You know, you talk about Adele or Kelly Clarkson or Josh Groban.
Yeah, the Adele one was really cool. So she played at the Hollywood Bowl, and this is before her, I think her second album hit, and then she went into the stratosphere. But she was maybe 19 or 20 years old, and they had hired a string orchestra to play along with her tracks from her album 19, which was her first album. And so I was hired to conduct the string section at the Hollywood Bowl, which was remarkable, right? It's about 10 years ago. And my wife was like 8.5 months pregnant with our first daughter. And so literally I had my cell phone with me, which I never do on stage, but I had my cell phone with me in case I got the call that, you know, the music's going to start with my wife having, you know, with the child and all that. But it was cool being on stage with her, and she was very humble, and I got to talk with her a little bit. I mean, they kind of do their own thing. And, you know, as a conductor for these shows, you don't necessarily have these big, long meetings or rehearsals. She was at the rehearsal for a little bit, but a lot of these artists, they sing as much as they want to sing to get ready. They don't sing the whole rehearsal. Because typically for me, like I know when we were on tour with Josh Groban, and actually Sarah McLachlan is another prominent artist that I've worked with. So our routine would be to rehearse that afternoon from like 3 o'clock till 5 or whatever it may be, and then the show at 8 or 7:30. So it's a very economical process. Like you're basically running through things. So Dan, it's not like you can say, all right, let's take it from 21 again, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, that doesn't happen. It's like, okay, play it through. If there's any questions, we'll go back and maybe touch on some things. But for the most part, you know, you're moving through, which is kind of a little glimpse for the students into what a life as a professional player is, you know, basically we would hire musicians in the orchestra from the local city that we were in. And then there'd be, you know, like I said, that one rehearsal, and I'd have to be, as a conductor and arranger for a lot of these things, I'd have to be so efficient in how I ran rehearsals because, you know, time is money and we don't have a lot of time to kind of dive into things. So, but kind of a funny side note, not necessarily a musical note, but kind of an experience thing is Josh Groban had invited me to go, basically we went around the world one year over the course of 8 months out of a 12-month period. And which was challenging being away from my family, but it also got me to some places I never would have been to, one of which was Cape Town in South Africa. And I remember we had a day off, and Josh's security guy came up to me and said, "Hey, you doing anything tomorrow? You have any plans, you know, in place?" I was like, "No." He goes, "Well, Josh wants to go shark diving off the coast of South Africa, Cape Town. Do you want to come?" And I was like, "You're crazy, right?" And he's like, no, for real. He goes, "We're going to take a helicopter to go to this place and then go out on a boat." And it was from one of the places that ran Shark Week on Nat Geo or whatever it is. So it was all those guys that were on that TV show. So I was like, "Oh, let's do it." So that's one of the things that I did is, you know, went on this crazy thing. And there was, at one point we're in the cage, which is against the side of the boat. And at one point, and the opening was small enough that they couldn't, you know, the teeth, they're not going to bite you. You know, you're pretty safe, even though you're in the water with these 16 feet great white sharks. And you smell like chum, right? Because they're putting all the chum in the water to make it, you know. And at one point, one of the sharks was kind of swimming, and then all of a sudden did a beeline and then turned in and rammed into the cage. And there were some choice words that I can't say on this Zoom right now, but you can imagine what that was. And Josh was like 2 people over next to me. And it was funny to see his reaction, you know, as this, you know, international singer superstar in the water with sharks with him. So it's funny what a music career can bring you that, I never thought I'd, in a million years we'd go shark diving in the middle of nowhere like that. But pretty cool experience. So, and then another quick one was with the group Pentatonics, which is probably a little bit more in your students' age range in terms of artists. And they're awesome. They're absolutely incredible musicians. And they asked me to write some orchestra arrangements for them for an NBC holiday special, the TV special they did a couple years ago. So little did I know, now I'm on TV with these guys. And the funniest part is we recorded the special like in October, the end of October, and it was like 110 degrees in LA. And you walk out of this, steamy outside and then into the theater where we recorded it, and there's Christmas trees and snow falling and all this. It was just such a dichotomy of like, oh my God, now we have to turn into Christmas mode in, the middle of October, and act all happy and sad and, Christmas-like. So it was a pretty cool experience, but one I won't forget. So pretty cool.
That is awesome. I don't want to use up too much of your time or anything, but before I ask at least the last questions that I have written down here on behalf of the students, if you guys have any questions and you're in on this conversation right now, just raise your hand, and I'm sure Larry can help unmute your microphone or whatever, and you can ask Sean a question too. But one that I have to ask as a teacher, of course, is how would you recommend any of my students or anyone in general get started composing? There are the silly things that I do in class that, involve creating music and, but if someone really wanted to sit down and get to work on a project like that, how would you recommend they do it?
I think you start with something that's familiar. And maybe for your string students, that's to write like a string quartet, like a basic string quartet, I think is a good starting point, because again, it's something familiar, and maybe give parameters. One of the first things I ever did was I took our school's alma mater and arranged it for, 4 people or 4 friends or whatever it may be. And then I got to play it. So that's, so it's not silly what you're doing at all, Dan, is getting them to write and maybe have parameters that are, write something that's 16 measures or 24, something on the smaller side, so they're not completely inundated with the pressure of writing a huge piece of music. So maybe it's, coming up with a little 4-bar melody or a 2-bar melody, and then passing it around the different ensemble, and then, writing little accompanying figures to match that. So just like small things like that. Another great tool for me, one of the things that happened in my form class in college was our professor basically had us take like a Bach invention, a piano, basic keyboard part, and we actually physically copied the notes that we saw, and we could see how Bach created the different lines and the different counterpoints. So even taking like a basic string piece, maybe a string orchestra, a published piece or one that the kids have played, and just literally make them copy out what that is on a separate, they can either use the notation software of choice, or if you use, like, get out the pencil and paper, heaven forbid, and actually go through and write. And it doesn't have to be publishing quality. It doesn't. It's more about the tactile connection to seeing what the notes do, and then playing it, and then seeing what every note do. You get a real connection to the music that way. I think that's a good one. Would you agree, Larry? Just a good way to get going?
Yeah, I mean, when I taught arranging, the first thing I would do is just have them take something that would be easily just to, like you said, write it out, like a Bach chorale, 4 parts. You could write it for string quartet, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and then play it. And then the students then start to get ownership in that music, even though they didn't write it.
And then
it's the tactile thing of just actually putting notes on the page that makes them feel like it's, partly theirs.
And don't worry about how good or bad it is. That's not, don't look at the scoreboard, I like to say. Just write it and keep writing, because the more I'm sure Larry has some real goats in his catalog from 30 years ago. I know some of my stuff, that never saw the light of day helped me become who I am now. Right. Because sometimes what the bad stuff is just as important as writing the good stuff, and allows you to write the better music along the way. So that's my suggestion.
So did I see a couple hands go up for questions? Yeah, there's one here. It doesn't have a name. It says 532. Starts with.
That's Lillian.
Okay, you want to go ahead? Okay, does she? Your microphone's off. Do you have it muted over there?
Technology for you.
Well, Lillian, it's not working.
Did Deegan have one? Deegan, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, let me unmute him. There you go, Deegan. You can go ahead.
How did you become this good at composing?
How did I become this good at composing? Well, thank you for that question. And I think it's like anything in life. The harder you work and the more you do it, and the better you can be at it. And I also listen a lot in addition to writing. I listen to a lot of music, and like I said, I'm still a big fan of film music, and I listen to movies just as much as I watch movies. And I kind of take notes as I go along, and then I try to emulate that, because one of the best ways to learn is to imitate. So that's exactly how I've kind of kept going, and I've had a few more years than you guys have to work at it, but there's plenty of opportunity to come. Thanks for that question.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? You want to try again?
Come on, Lillian, we got this.
I'm trying to get you unmuted. There we go. Try again.
Oh, I thought I heard something there.
I'm pushing unmute. You got to do it over there too.
There we go.
Well, that is just not working.
Might try typing it, Lillian, and then.
Hey, you could send us a chat and I'll read it to Sean. Wasn't there another one down there that had I saw a hand up? She's typing fast.
Lillian's actually an honorary Lynx Orchestra student during the school closures.
Okay.
Oh, welcome.
She'll be joining us next fall as a sixth grader.
She says, who inspired you guys to become composers? I guess that was...
Yeah, I just saw that too. Excellent question. For me, it was when I was in high school, my band director at the time had a vinyl record copy of the Star Wars soundtrack that he let me borrow. And I started listening to the Star Wars soundtrack, and I said, I want to do that. And so that kind of put me on my path of listening and emulating the style of John Williams, and then, you know, from there kind of creating your own style. But he was certainly the inspiration for getting me going. And Carter, I see your question too. What was your favorite film score? Well, I kind of answered that one, didn't I, with Star Wars? But it's kind of an ongoing thing. I mean, John just finished the 9th movie that he's written for the Star Wars series, so it feels like one big, 9-movie score that he's created. And it's amazing how he keeps coming up with ideas that just when you think there's none left for that series, that he does it even more. So pretty cool thing. And one more here, I think. What elements do you like to add in most of your pieces? Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things I am really adamant about, and I know Larry does this in his music as well, is we try to pass the melody around to all the different instruments in the ensemble as much as we can, because, you bass and cello players there, I mean, my God, you're stuck on those low notes all day long, right? So it's important for you to play in a melodic sense much more so than a supporting sense as well. So that's one of the elements that I like to do in each of my pieces. Even at the professional level, I'll try and find spots with which the low voices can have a shot at the melody, because, the flutes, the violins, and usually the violas too, you guys always have a chance to play melody in the different pieces that you play in your ensemble. And so having something for the lower instruments, the cello basses, and then the lower voices in the winds to play melody, I think is very, very important. And even percussion too. Percussion can have a melodic, prominent part in all this
Sure.
without losing the sense of it. So that's what I like to do.
Carter asked another one. He said, do I have to go to a big name college for
Don't stop
composing?
trying to push you. They are.
Do I have to go to a big name college for composing?
Yeah, you can play it on TV.
I love technology. You have to go to the right place to get what you need. For me, going to Syracuse and meeting Larry was the right place for me because I was able to get the kind of experience that I needed to become a better musician. And once I left Syracuse, I went to New England Conservatory in Boston. And yes, that's a bigger name music school, but I think the more important element of that was that the teacher there was really good. I had a really good composition teacher. And also I got to go to the Boston Symphony concerts across the street all the time because I worked there as a bartender and on the coffee staff. So I got to see all these great concerts and I put myself in a position of opportunity. And so being in kind of a very cool area for music is, I think, more important than the name on the school. So it's the right fit for you, I think is the main case there.
Sydney asked, do you typically like to write faster paced or slower paced pieces?
You know, it's interesting. I think slower paced pieces are harder to write because each note means a little bit more in sense of duration, so that you have to choose your notes a little bit more carefully, because sometimes fast music will just kind of go across and you can kind of, make an effect more so than a musical thing. So I really enjoy the slower music. I think there's a lot of opportunity for emotion that you can't necessarily get with fast music. So that's my answer.
When has been the scariest time for composing and performing for you?
The scariest time?
Yeah, is that from Lillian?
That's Lillian? Oh, nice. All right, you put me on the spot. There was one moment where I was on tour with Josh Groban, and we had a concert scheduled in Paris, and it was, I think, 3 weeks after a terrorist bombing that happened there a few years ago. And there was thoughts of whether to go or not. We were in England for a few dates, and then we took the Euro train over to Paris. And so there was heavy security. Half the audience didn't show up because they were a little concerned. And the performance that Josh gave was amazing. When he sang "You Raise Me Up," his big song at the end, the whole audience had their cell phone lights on, and it was just a really, really cool moment amongst this kind of, anxious time and scary time of being in a foreign country during, a time of unrest. So, but, out of some of those scariest moments come the greatest moments, and you got to always kind of look at it with a glass half full kind of mentality, as I like to do. So maybe one more, Larry?
Yeah, there is one more. Deegan says, what gave you the idea to become a composer?
Deegan, you're asking me the tough questions today. I like it, bud. Thank you. I don't know if I didn't really set out to be a composer. I set out to I have a music ed degree from my undergrad, and so I wanted to be a music teacher. And as I was going through my studies in undergrad, I started writing a lot more and ended up getting a dual degree in composition. But I've always kind of gone back to my music ed roots because I had to learn how to play all the instruments. In fact, in string methods, I volunteered to play viola because I wanted to learn how to read alto clef and play that instrument with kind of relative ease. So, but I think the teaching background that I had really inspired me and gave me the tools as a composer to really be successful, because when I'm writing, an individual part for a player, having at least some of that experience of trying to tactily play that instrument, my God, you do not want to hear me on oboe. God bless the oboes, but it's but at least that experience, the break in the clarinet or moving across the strings on a first position, second, whatever it may be. I mean, having that experience gives you a real background of, okay, this will work and this won't work, and how do you cater the music that you write to kind of be the most efficient and the best music that you can within the technical demands. So there you have it. Awesome, guys.
Well, Sean, thanks for taking the time to talk to everyone today. It's Council Bluff, is that correct? I said it right? So Dan, thank you for asking all the great questions, and we appreciate it. And we hope you all stay safe and healthy throughout this challenging time. and get back to school, because although I'm sure for a while it's okay and fun to not be in school, after a while it kind of gets boring too. So it'd be nice to get back to school and actually play in your orchestra too.
Agreed.
So take care, everybody, and wave at the camera as I say goodbye. Give us a big wave.